Hi everyone. So, got a couple specimens here to show you, and we're going to use these to look at the kind of morphology and anatomy of a couple of birds. The first one I have here is a seabird. This is a northern fulmar that I found on the beach. So, a couple interesting features right off the bat. This is one of the tube noses. This is a type of seabird that lives in the open ocean. I don't know if you can see its bill there, but it's got that tube on its nose. Nice hooked bill. Very gray. These are normally much lighter in color. This is a darker gray morph. Got this kind of pointed wing that it's using for dynamic soaring out in the ocean. And then some webbed feet here, so you guys can kind of see nice simple webbing between its front three toes. So these are the forward three pointing toes and a very small hallux here at the back. Alright, so first thing is to get to know a little bit of the bird's topography. So just a couple of key points here. Let me see if I can get them situated in a way where you can kind of see them in profile. So first, kind of head topography. We've got up here at the top of the head, this would be the crown. In this case, he's pretty uniform in color. Notice some colorations there. No face lines. This would be kind of the auricular area here. So this is kind of over where the ears are. Then we would have the lores right above where the eye is here, and then the malar and throat down kind of under the bill. If we go on the back here, you can see this is getting into the nape area, so kind of the back of the neck. If they have their head up, this would be the nape right here, leading right into the back covers and the scapulars here. The scapulars are the feathers that actually cover the wing when it's folded in. So I don't know if you can see, but the wing usually kind of tucks under some feathers there. These are what we call the scapular feathers. And then the back here is what we would call the mantle that we can see when the wings are folded. If we spread out the wing a bit, seabirds have nice long wings where you can see the morphology very well. So right here at the end, these are the primary flight feathers, and they can spread these out as they're flying to control kind of airflow through the wings very easily. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's see where that ends. Looks like 9 primaries, which is pretty typical for a bird. And then here, these are the secondaries, and on seabirds they have a lot. Very long wings. These are variable from species to species. Okay, changing the angle here a bit, you can now see the secondaries here, and then this next row of feathers right over it, these are called the coverts. So they're covering the main flight feathers. So here's the primary coverts, and then over the secondaries, the coverts that go over the secondaries are called the greater coverts. When their wing is folded in, the greater coverts are typically what you see. So whenever you see, in field guides where they have a wing bar, that's usually the greater coverts that form that feature. And then above that we have the median coverts. Now this part of the wing here, so this is all feather, so right here is where the wing starts. Has a couple of interesting features. One is this little feature here called the alula, which will be hard to see, but you can see the feathers that come off the alula. These are basically feathers that are used in low-speed flight to avoid stalling. So basically it reduces vortexes forming over the wing. So they can kind of use that almost like a thumb, where they kind of raise it or lower it depending on how they want air to be moving over the wing. So from here to here, this is basically akin to the hand, right? So their hand is here, all the bones are fused. Then this part right here, this is going to be the forearm, And then their elbow is right down here about where my thumb is. Let me move that so you can see a little better. And then this is the upper arm and then the shoulder up here. So the primaries are all attached basically to the hand. The secondaries are all attached to what's the same as the forearm. And then there are these feathers right here. These are the tertiaries, which basically keep the kind of shape of the wing all the way to the body. So as they spread these wings, you can kind of see that makes this nice airfoil here, with the majority of the airfoil being formed by the secondaries, but the primaries are the ones that really extend the wing. During flapping, it's the primaries that are the main thrust, and they can fine-tune kind of the spreading of the primaries in order to affect the airfoil that they're forming. So we move farther down on the body. So here this would be the rump, right? So again, if we close the wings, the rump is often covered by the wings when they're at rest. And then we see it when they're exposed. And this goes right down to the tail, which I'll spread here. Okay. So just again, some terminology on feathers. The main flight feathers, the primaries and the secondaries, are called remiges. The tail feathers we call rectrices. And here there's nothing too extraordinary about this bird's tail, but you can see they spread out nicely. And this is basically used as like a rudder in flight for steering. We flip over onto its underside. Okay, we have, again, the throat. Hopefully you guys can see that. The throat, and then the breast of the bird. Okay, so the chest is the breast. These kind of undersides, especially down here right along the wings, we would call the flanks, and the belly. Right, and then as the bird is sitting, right, kind of the part that's behind the legs, down here, you know, what we might colloquially call the butt, this is typically called the vent. And so these are all really important parts of the bird to know, because when you look at bird guides, they're going to use this terminology. So let me show you another specimen now, and we'll kind of compare the morphology of these. This bird was on the beach, so lots of sand here. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit here. Okay, so this bird unfortunately hit my window, so he had some skull trauma. But this is a small little bird called an orange-crowned warbler, so much smaller, you can see. Hopefully you guys can see this color here, called an orange-crowned warbler because, as the name implies, oops, let's see if I can focus in on this. Very hard to do this. But some orange coloration on the crown. You almost never see that. They can raise and lower their feathers on their crown, and then that ultimately can show it off when it wants to, but most of the time you don't see it. But you can see very lovely bird, and now we have some colorations that we can map on, right? So we have an orange crown here on the nape and onto the mantle, kind of this nice olive green color. In this case, I think you guys can see this, but it's got a very slight yellow eye ring, so right around the eye, some nice yellow coloration there. And then kind of the throat and breast are kind of this yellowish color, getting more lemon yellow as we go down to the flanks. Okay, we spread out that wing again. Now we've got a very typical wing here. Make sure you're in focus. Nice pass ring, songbird wing. So here we've got the primaries up here, the secondaries down here. The coverts are a little less distinct, but they're forming kind of this nice scaly pattern here. And then I don't know if you guys can see this. Let me get a tool to point it out with. But right here, that's the alula that I'm kind of teasing up there. So they have that alula as well. In this case, nice beautiful feathers. This was a pretty bird when it was alive. Kind of a yellowish tinge to its rump. Again, it's rectrices here. We can kind of spread them out so you can kind of see what the tail looks like. They're spread out. And then the vent here is kind of this lemon yellow with a little bit of a whitish wash right around the legs. So again, very similar. You can see very distinct bill on these warblers. These are small insect-eating birds. So that's its external morphology. So we were talking about the feathers on these specimens. I've got a few example feathers here. These I think are mostly from geese. Just showing you some of the details of the feathers. These two large ones here are very typical flight feathers. So this one here is a primary. A couple of kind of noticeable aspects of flight feathers, ones that are made for flight, is they tend to be very asymmetrical. So here we've got kind of a larger kind of vein on the posterior side of the feather, the narrower vein on the kind of leading edge of the feather. And these veins, of course, are made by lots of little barbs that are all hooked together by the barbules. So you can see here we've got a very solid rachis. In this case, the tip of this feather down here by my finger, this would actually swivel on little bumps in the bone, and this would be firmly attached to the skin, and by pulling on that skin, they're able to actually move the feather, pivot it around. And that way they can affect the shape of their wing, right, the shape of their airfoil. A couple of other kind of noticeable things, as you might be able to see that on the leading vein, it's kind of thicker here, and then there's a dip, and it gets thinner. That's called an emargination. Similarly, on the trailing edge, you can see it's wider here at the base, and then gets, again, thinner as you go to the top. This is an emargination. This one's called a notch. And the reason they have those is basically when the flight feathers are together, they make basically one kind of constant surface, but this means that they can move them out and create little gaps in the feathers. And they can actually kind of raise and lower the feathers to adjust then the airflow through those. And that lets them really fine-tune kind of how air is flowing over the wing and lets them have very fine control. This is particularly common on birds that fly slowly or that soar. Soaring birds have very deep notches so that they can basically almost like, wiggle their feathers. They can wiggle their fingers. These feathers can get kind of moved to affect fine scale airflow. So these two are probably primaries. This feather here, again, it's less asymmetrical, but still some asymmetry here. This is probably a secondary. Maybe it's a rectress, but my guess is it's a secondary. Most rectrices are more symmetrical. But again, this is now going to be kind of tailing on the bottom side of the wing, forming the airfoil with these kind of overlapping. And if you look at the shape and profile, you can see they're kind of meant to overlap. So you've got kind of a concave versus a convex leading edge versus trailing edge. That means they fit together very nicely. So those are the flight feathers. Then we have the body feathers, which include contour feathers. And then this feather here I wanted to show you, this is a semi-plume. So you can see at the top we have a feather that basically looks like a contour feather. At the bottom we have this very fluffy stuff that looks like down. And that's exactly what it is, right? So we'll have down close to the body forming an insulating layer. We'll have contour feathers creating a nice smooth surface on the outer part of the body. And then these feathers are kind of in between, where the down here is for insulation, but then it overlaps with other feathers and starts to provide the form that the contour feathers would provide. So let's take a look at a feather under the microscope, and we'll start with a semi-plume so we can look at some down. If we look at the down very carefully, we can see that it's very fluffy, very filamentous. We can see the barbs here, but there's no barbules on the edge, so again, it's not going to stick together. So let's play with it a bit. So here we're seeing another view where I'll tease it here with a probe. And you can see as I'm moving the elements of the feathers around, there's really no cohesion, right? This is just fluff. Lots of fluff, though, and you can see lots of air gets trapped within the structure here. So it makes it great for insulation, but it doesn't give the feather much structure. And if we zoom in really close here, you can just see how smooth these barbs are, right? Nothing to really connect. Now, if instead we look at a rim image, so here, this is more typical of a contour feather or a flight feather. Now, when we look really closely, we can see there's a lot more structure, right? We can see that on those barbs, we have these little barbules, so that means there can be more cohesion. So here we're looking at one of the surfaces of the feather. We'll probe it with the probe again. And you can see that as I move this around, those barbs are now moving together. They're stuck together, right? And it's really done by those little barbules, which act kind of like Velcro. So here we've got a slightly different view here. And now, I'm going to actually tear kind of those barbs apart. So I'm using that probe to kind of unzip the barbules. And you can see now I've got kind of a gash in the surface of the feather. We'll pull that apart a little bit. And then let's zoom in and take a closer look at what this feather, has going on here. Let me get this lined up and focused. Okay, so now we can see up close right where that separation occurred. And you can start to see the little barbs have little serrations, the barbules, have little serrations on them. You can almost see these little hair-like structures on those filaments. That, like I said, is basically going to act like Velcro. And so as I kind of move and tease this, you'll see that they're kind of holding together even, as I apply some pressure on them. You pull hard enough, you can separate them, but they do stick pretty well. And importantly for the bird, these can be repaired. So here, if I squish the feather back together, you can see that those little barbules reattach to one another. So kind of, Velcro. And this is just me using my finger. Birds have a lot more practice. But here as we zoom out, you can see that gash I created has now been kind of reattached and sealed. If I use the probe to kind of move this around again, you'll see that, again, they're adhered together. So now that surface can withstand some pulling and tugging, and you'll see that these barbs are going to remain together. So let me get the probe here. And you can see now they're kind of sticking together. And you can kind of see a little area, where I initially opened it. I can kind of smooth it out a little bit. But, with a little coaxing and smoothing, you can see that, these basically seal right back. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to skin the bird. And I'm going to remove the skin so that we can create a study skin for the campus biological collection. So this will be a skin that, future students can learn from and study. So I'm going to skin this really quick. When I skin this, I'll basically removing the skin, pulling the body out. When you create a skin, the bones remain in the wing. So the wing bones will remain. We'll cut them from the body. The leg bones also remain, so we'll be cutting those off. And the skull remains to give the head some shape. So what I'm going to do is basically take the rest out. We'll then dissect the body and examine some of the internal anatomy. So here we have our freshly skinned bird. This is the skin here. Right now it's kind of inverted inside out. These are the wing bones. Got the leg bones kind of sticking out here. You can see the feathers kind of coming out. And then we've got the body here. Now I'm preparing the skin for making a study skin. So in that case, the skull is going to remain with the rest of the skin. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of anatomy before I cut the skull off the rest of the body, and we go ahead and dissect the body. So just to give you a quick orientation on the body. Hopefully you guys can see this. The sun's come out, so it's a bit more glare. But this is the breast of the bird. You can just see the keel bone right here. These are the flight muscles. This is, you know, the shoulder and the wing bone that I cut. Obviously the neck and then the head. If we look at the head a little more closely, you can see the eye in there. Some muscles and tissues right above the eye. I don't know how focused this is on the screen right now, but you can see there's this kind of spongy material above the eye. That's actually the salt glands that remove salts from the blood. So this is a seabird, so it drinks salt water. And then if we look underneath, we can see the mandibles here and the trachea coming out there. This will also be hard to see once we start cutting, so I just wanted to hopefully show you. But right in here, so this is called the furcula. This is the kind of the chest bone here that acts like a spring during flight. But in between, you can see this thin membrane. Right now it's kind of deflated, but this is actually part of the avian air sac system. So this is one of the larger air sacs. If I pull on the tissue there, you can just kind of see it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the head, then we're going, or the skull, and then we're going to dissect the body and look at some of the internal organs. So for the head, this is going to keep the head shape in the study skin that I'm making. Basically, I'm going to remove the eyes. We'll take a look at how large the eyes are. I'll then cut basically the back of the skull and pull out what's inside. So as I'm pulling the eyes, again, this might be hard for you to see, but the optic nerve is here in the back along with some musculature that allows for the eye to be moved. And I'm just trying to get a hold of it so I can pull out the eye. And here we see a typical bird eye. This, so you can see it relative to the background. They have fairly large eyes for the size of their head. They also have kind of a unique thing. I guess it's not unique. Reptiles have this, mammals don't. But there's actually a ring of bone around the eye. It's called the sclerotic ring here, that actually makes the eye quite rigid. So now I'm going to do the same thing for the other eye. Okay, now we've got the empty eye cavities here. So if you look at the skull, right, we tend to think, you know, skull is full of brains. Birds are intelligent, but in terms of body size, you know, the brain is in this part of the skull right here. You can see that most of the space here, you know, what we think of as their head, is actually devoted to the eyes. So a significant proportion of their body is devoted to those very large eyes. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is remove the tongue here. So basically I'm kind of pulling at the tongue. There's a lot of connective tissue here. Normally when I'm not doing this for an anatomy lesson, I just tear through all that connective tissue, but I like to try to keep the tongue intact to give you a look at the bird tongue. So basically I'm slicing through the connective tissue here that connects the tongue to the mandible. And now I've got the tongue out. So again, birds have very unique tongues. I don't know if you can see this, but they have these little flaps that actually help them bring food down their throat. On some birds, this is really long and well developed. Thrushes, for example, have a big fork here, but basically they get a little pocket under that flap that allows them to pull food down their throat. And so now you can see this is basically the alimentary canal, the beginning of the alimentary canal. So food would be going down into that tube down there. Now, if you look right below the alimentary canal, you can kind of see this hose-like structure. It's got kind of these ribs on there, these ridges. That's actually the larynx, so the trachea. So this is where air goes down into the lungs. And then this flap here that just looks like kind of loose tissue right now, that's actually the throat where food would go down. Okay, so we got that out of the way. Cut this down a little bit. I'm now going to cut through the skull, because basically we just want the outer part of the skull left with the skin. So kind of all the inside parts we're gonna get rid of. Okay, so I've opened up the skull. I wasn't very careful to protect the brain because for our purposes I need to keep the skull kind of smooth on top. But inside you can see the brain. Birds have very well-developed brains, much like humans. Unfortunately, when they're frozen, it tends to degrade, so you're not going to see much other than kind of pink ooze, but that's actually the brain material there. This bird was previously frozen, so it's pretty well broken down. There's not a lot of features on the brain to see right now. And mostly I just want to clean that out. Okay. So now we're looking at the body. Hold it sideways at first. So just to orient you, here is the kind of leg bone I cut. So this is the hip here. You can just make out the ribs right here. Here's, the shoulder and the arm. This is its pectoralis. So this is its breast muscle. And we'll be looking at kind of the layers of breast muscle in just a minute. This just exposed is the keel, so this is the breastbone. Like I showed you earlier, here is the furcula, so this is that kind of wishbone. And then you can just see the membrane of the air sac in there. So if I pull that out, that's the air sac membrane. And then, of course, the neck with the trachea quite visible there. If we look on the back, we can see, this is where the spine is. They have a lot of fusion, so most of their thoracic spine is really inflexible. So that's right here, kind of in the chest area. Their hip is also very tightly fused, so not a lot of flexure there. You can see it can move kind of between those two areas, and then of course a lot of flexion in the neck vertebrae. So if they need to turn around and look, they turn their neck rather than the rest of their body. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is we'll cut into the breast, look at the breast muscles a little bit. We'll then open up the body cavity and look at the internal organs. So just to start with, again, these breast muscles, there's two layers. The outer layer, which pulls for the downstroke, tends to be the slightly bigger part of the muscle. Directly underneath is the supracorticoidal muscle. That actually wraps around the shoulder and pulls up. So during the flapping motion, the upper muscle in the breast pulls down, the lower breast in the muscle pulls back up. So we're going to try to expose those muscles here so you can see the different layers. So I'm going to start by just cutting right along, in this case, the keel here. So this is where the muscles attach right to the breastplate. And both of those muscles attach quite firmly to this keel. Okay, so as I peel this muscle up, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this on screen, but there's basically two layers of muscle. So here, the larger muscle, this is the muscle that pulls the wing down. Underneath, this is the muscle that pulls the wing back up. So they're separated by this kind of loose tissue here that allows them to slide past one another. Now on this bird, this muscle looks very red. That's because these are aerobic flyers. If you're used to, if you eat chicken, for example, the breast meat tends to be very white. That's because they are not aerobic flyers. They don't use that muscle extensively. So in this case, they have white muscle tissue, which can produce a lot of power quickly, but tires out very quick as it's not functioning aerobically. So again, upper muscle layer pulls the wing down, lower muscle layer pulls the wing up. For those of you who do cook with chicken, you guys are probably familiar with this. The breast muscle and then the tender underneath is actually that muscle that pulls the wing back up. Cool. Now under that, we've got the breastplate. So let me just separate this a little more. So in this case, I'm down to bone here. So this is the breastplate here, and then this is the keel on the breastplate where those flight muscles attach. Right at the edge here, as I cut through this muscle a little farther, we start getting to the ribs. And later when we show the skeleton a little more clearly, you'll see that bird ribs are quite different than ours. Let me get rid of this connective tissue and maybe we'll be able to see it. Okay, so now I'm exposing the ribs. And the ribs on a bird are actually jointed. So again, I don't know how well this shows on the camera, but right here there's a bend in the ribs, and those actually flex. And when birds breathe, they're not breathing like we do. They don't have like a blind sac lung that they're filling and emptying. Instead, they have a one-way lung with a number of air sacs that are pushing air through the lungs. So that'll be covered a lot more in lecture. But basically, as they're ventilating, right, they have to pump that air. They do that by moving their breastplate forward and back relative to their body. So I don't know if you can see this movement, but this is, kind of an exaggerated version of what a bird would be doing while it's breathing. And so as the breastplate basically moves up and down, that's pumping, that's what pumps air through the air sacs, and these hinges on the ribs allow that movement to happen. Now with birds, maintaining center of gravity is very important, so you'll also see that most of the weight is really kind of centered here underneath the breast muscle. So the breast muscles have a lot of weight, and then all the organs are kind of in this compartment here, right? They taper down very quickly as we move back. That again lets these birds maintain their center of balance. Kind of an aside, as I've been pumping the lungs, I don't know, again, how well you can see this. See if I can turn this into the light. But you can kind of see the air sac there inflating and deflating there in the chest. So you can see when I pump that, that's pushing air into that air sac. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at that structure there, I'm going to cut into the body. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to cut through these ribs here and do the same on the other side and lift the breastplate out of the way so then we can examine the internal organs. So now I've kind of opened up the body cavity. Kind of the first things that really stand out is here we've got the liver. So this is the major lobes of the liver here. So they're going to be kind of ventrally located within the body cavity. You can move those aside. We can see the intestines down here. And then this is the heart here. So they have very well-developed muscular hearts. They've got, four-chambered hearts, just like mammals do, with kind of flow to the body as well as through the lungs for oxygenation. The lungs themselves are usually right below the heart. So I don't know if you can see this tissue right here. These are the lungs. Bird lungs, remember, are not expanding, contracting like human lungs. Instead, these are going to be kind of one-way passages through which air is forced. So you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but strong vasculature here moving blood into the lungs. So there's some lung tissue that I'm kind of pulling out there. If I kind of pull this connective tissue that kind of suspends all the organs in place here, we can start to pull some out. Down here, these are probably the kidneys near the bottom. And this is getting kind of soupy and juicy down here. I'm not sure how much else we'll get to see down here. But a lot of the accessory digestive organs are kind of, in this case, anterior to the digestive system. And then somewhere down in here, this is going to be very hard to see in this bird, are the gonads as well. So here are the intestines. They're all coiled up. Let's see if I can loosen some of this. So here are the intestines here. Unfortunately, we've got some decomposition. I can see kind of the gases in here. So this is going to get fairly stinky for me. So I'm not going to open up the digestive system. Okay. The stomach would be up in this region here. And in birds that have a crop, the crop would be up here along the chest for the digestive system. Okay. Right below the heart, see if I can move the heart out of the way so you guys can see this. We've got this fork in the trachea. So this is leading to the two anterior air sacs that then push air into the lungs. So I'm kind of holding it up there. I don't know how well you can see, but there's a fork in the trachea. And that's pushing into these anterior air sacs, which then are two of the primary air sacs that push air through the bird. And right above that, this is probably the top of the stomach. So you can see kind of the stomach up there. All right, so liver, very large heart. You can see that is a large part of it. Then the intestines, and of course some of the accessory organs down here. Now that I look at this, this may be the ovary. This might have been a female. I have to dig in here a little more closely to see. Excellent. So not the prettiest sight, but still pretty interesting to see the different parts, the different organs inside the body. Now looking at a couple other things here. Again, if we look at the back, I've cut off the pygostyle. That remains with the skin, but just under the skin, above the pygostyle, kind of in this position, this is where the preen glands would be, so the orpidgeal glands, and yeah. Okay, so we finished the dissection of the fulmar, the seabird. I didn't record the dissection of the orange-crowned warbler, but I did want you to see kind of what the anatomy of a small passerine would look like, and kind of what the organs look like in a fresher bird. So I do have some still images from a passerine dissection. So quickly, I just wanted to kind of go through those and kind of go over some of the major organs again. So the pictures you're looking at now are of the chest, the exposed chest of a small passerine. On the left, that's kind of the intact chest where the skin, we've cut through the skin and peel that back. And you can start to see some interesting structures here, including the bright yellow stuff there are actually fat deposits. You can see, so to orient you in this picture, the top of the picture would be kind of the neck towards the head, the bottom of the picture would be down towards the tail. So that fat deposit is right, kind of in the chest. And birds, they peck on a lot of fat, especially, when they're getting ready to breed, especially when they're preparing to migrate, but they've got to keep all that weight again central in their body, so a lot of the fat goes right on their chest and then sometimes along their back. The other thing we can start to see is some little hints at the skeletal structure there. So right there you're seeing that little white line there is one edge of the furcula, and then where the furcula come together, you can see that white line down the center. That's the tip of the keel on the sternum. And then, of course, all the pink stuff are their breast muscles. And what you're looking at there, that's the pectoralis, right? That's that large muscle that powers the downstroke of the wing. Now, the picture on the right is a photo after we've sliced through the breast muscle there. So you're looking at the internal structure of the breast muscle. So again, the pectoralis muscle is still visible there. And then kind of right below that, you can see the supracoracoideus muscle there as well. So you can see that thin white line that separates the two. But again, those are the main flight muscles. These pictures now show after the breast muscle and the sternum have been removed. So now we're seeing the organs in the body cavity. So the sternum and the ribs are gone. On the left, we're looking kind of top down on the ventral side of the bird. And again, we can see the liver, so the big yellow kind of fleshy bits there. There's two lobes of the liver, one on the left, one on the right. We can also see the heart there. So again, very clear, large muscular heart. Birds tend to have very large muscles or very large hearts relative to the size of their body. So you can see that there. We can also see bits of the digestive system now. So right below kind of the lobe on what would be the bird's left liver lobe, we see the gizzard. So the gizzard is basically one part of the stomach. It's the major part of the stomach in birds, and particularly in birds that are seed eaters or that have food that needs to get ground up. The gizzard tends to be really large and muscular. So remember, birds don't chew. They say weight in the bill, so they don't have the teeth and kind of grinding motion that mammals use to break apart food. Rather, they have a system where they'll consume the food. It'll go into kind of a loose pouch in the chest called a crop, where the food is kind of softened. And then it moves into the gizzard, where this muscular action actually grinds up. It basically does the chewing for the bird. So again, that's in there along with the gastric juices. So the gizzard is basically the major part of the stomach on this bird. And right kind of emanating from the gizzard and curving around underneath it, we also see the intestines there. And what you're looking at there is kind of, one of the top loops of the small intestine. Now in the picture on the right, we're now looking kind of at a lateral view. And again, we see the heart, the liver, and the gizzard all present here as well. And then importantly, you see kind of this pink spongy stuff kind of under the heart. That is the lung. So again, the lungs are not sacs that inflate and deflate like they are in mammals. Rather, they'd have the air sacs pushing air through that lung structure. So you can kind of see the fine structure within the lung. That's all the vascularization and kind of the air passages that allow for gas exchange. Now, if we kind of probe a little deeper, the picture on the left again shows kind of the liver and the heart kind of moved out to show the digestive system in place. So again, we've got liver and heart there. And again, we have the gizzard and the intestine visible, but now you can start to see the loops of the intestine. If we remove the heart and the liver and pull out the intestine, that's when we get the picture on the right. So again, the gizzard and the small intestine are still visible there. You can see how long the small intestine is. You know, that's all packed up and curled around. And then you can just get a peek there at the large intestine underneath. Despite their names, the small intestine is far longer than the large intestine, but the large intestine there is where they're basically going to be kind of collecting their refuse, right? The small intestine is where most of the nutrient exchange takes place. Then if we move the digestive system out of the way, we can start to see some of the smaller organs that are below that. So now, again, we're looking more posterior in the bird, right, towards its back as we kind of dig down from the ventral side. And probably the main feature you can see here is the kidney. So you can see that structure there. Those are the kidneys. The gonads, the sexual organs, are usually located right above the kidneys. So kind of that lobe there is probably one of the testes. Looks like this is probably a male, I think. I'm not the best at sexing them, but I think that's a testes there. And then kind of the pictures to the right are showing bisections of the heart and the gizzard, so you can see how thick and muscular they are. Again, birds have a large four-chambered heart that works very similarly to our hearts, right, and to mammal hearts. And then below that, we see the gizzard, and you can see the thick lining there. That's very muscular. They're using that to grind up food. And again, birds that eat particularly tough foods like seeds, they'll often swallow little stones or sand to help grind things up in the gizzard with this muscular action. And they do that instead of chewing. Here now we have the skeleton of a seabird. I'm pretty sure this is also a fulmar, although this is a different individual than the one that we dissected to look at the internal organs. Fortunately, I found it pretty clean on the beach, so we can start to look at the skeletal morphology a little bit. And it's going to kind of come apart here. It's pretty fragile, but I'll kind of show you the different parts. And we can start, well, let's start with the skull. So here you can see the bird's skull. Unlike our skull, it doesn't have nearly as many plates in the head, so kind of a uniform brain case here. This individual, it had been drying on the beach for a while. Let me move this so that you don't have as much problem in the background. You can actually see the bony covering here coming off. So the bird's bill is bone with kind of this horny keratinous sheath on it. So I don't know if you can see I'm kind of peeling that off there. That's the horny part on the top. And you can see the underlying bone. Now this, being a Procelariformes, has the tube nose, and here you can see that tube is actually made up from that horny sheath. If I pull that back, you can see the open nostrils right underneath. So this is the upper mandible and the lower mandible. Now this individual is pretty well dried, but obviously the lower mandible hinges and they can open the lower mandible. You might see there's this little bone right here kind of coming up along the side of the mouth here that connects the upper mandible. And it's going to be hard for you to see on the video, but there's basically a thin part of the bone here, and this actually has, in a fresh individual, cartilage and some softer tissues that actually acts as a hinge. And so a lot of birds, including these seabirds, can actually pull the upper mandible up. They can basically lift the upper mandible up relative to the skull. And so that gives them a lot of flexibility in their mouth. Now on this side of the skull, you can also make out this ring here, and I haven't really worked all the tissue off there because it would fall apart, but this is actually a bone called the sclerotic ring, made up of a bunch of small little bones actually called sclerotic ossicles. And these give structure and support the eye. So again, you might remember in the fresh specimen how large the eye was. When I pulled the eye out, this was actually on the eye that I pulled out. But this is actually part of the skeleton right here. And basically most of the eye would be down underneath this, but then with the lens of the eye bulging out through here. And so that helps support their very large eyes. Muscles can attach to these bones and allow movement of the eye. So very, very interesting skull. On the underside here, there are these nice thin bones that I'm kind of tugging at there and there. These bones are actually together called the hyoid process. They kind of come together and fuse down here and actually attach to the tongue. And these are actually where the muscles attach that move the tongue. So the muscle attachment is actually on the back of the skull. On woodpeckers, which have really long extensible tongues, these hyoid processes actually extend back over the top of the skull. And in a few species of woodpecker, including the northern flickers that we get here, they actually wrap all the way over the top of the skull, and the muscle attachments are actually at the front of the skull, or in the case of the northern flicker, they'll actually go through the front nostril. So that basically allows them to stick their long tongues out of their bill. Obviously on a seabird, we don't have that need for a super long tongue, so instead we have these much shorter hyoid processes that are much similar to what we would see in most birds. Now you can also see here, this is the attachment point for the spine, right? This spinal cord would go and connect to the brain in here. And you'll see there's one big bump here. That's called the occipital condyle. And this is one of the things that separates birds from mammals, is we would have two of these processes here. They just have one big one. All right, so that's the skull. Below that, we now have the cervical vertebrae. So hopefully you guys can see that here. So this is basically the spine on the neck. And you can see very large vertebrae, big attachment points for muscles. So you can see kind of, these big ridges coming off. Birds have very flexible necks, and they use that for, looking around and moving their head, obviously. So most of their flexibility is going to be in these neck vertebrae. Through most of the rest of the body, the vertebrae are fused. So I'll kind of flip this over so we can look at the back. Try not to break it any more than it's already broken here. Okay, so now kind of looking at the spine here, you can see these are the thoracic vertebrae here. They now have these long projections here, and there's usually really tough connective tissue here, which means this part of their body really doesn't flex. It's pretty rigid, and that's important for flight, that their body remain pretty rigid. They don't have a lot of flexibility in their thoracic spine. Here is the pelvis. You can see, again, very fused together, again adding rigidity. And then there's some flexibility here in the tail, but again, not a long bony tail. This is basically within the body of the bird, right? The part that we call the tail are the feathers that attach to this kind of fused bone right here, okay? So earlier we were talking about the pygostyle. This is the bone that forms the pygostyle right there. So very typical for birds to have a lot of fused bones that basically make their body very rigid. Now, while we're looking at the back, you'll also see this bone here. This is the scapula. This is where some of the shoulder muscles attach and give some of the movement to kind of their shoulders here. Now, if we flip this back over, now we can see the breast and ribs, and there's a couple of pretty important bones here. So first, we've got the sternum. Okay. Now on mammals, on us for example, we have a very flat sternum. Birds, flighted birds, have a keeled sternum. So you can see right here, this is the keel. These are where those major flight muscles attach. So when we did the dissection, I exposed this part of the bone so I could show you the flight muscles. But now you can see in this case a very broad surface for muscle attachment. And then I also kind of showed you the ribs on the live specimen. This one isn't flexible, so I can't show you how the chest moves in and out. But again, you can see there's kind of hinge points here and hinge points here that allow, again, that muscle to kind of pump, or excuse me, the breastplate to pump up and down. That's how they ventilate. And then you see these ribs with these long overlapping processes, again, to provide extra support from compression on the sides. So very elaborate kind of rib structure compared to ours. If I move this around to the front, not sure what angle you can see this past that, but this is the furcula, what we commonly call the wishbone. If you guys ever fight over the wishbone at Thanksgiving or something, that's this bone here. And this is a kind of a unique structure here that basically acts like a spring in birds that fly. So as they pump their wings down, there's tension on that bone. It acts kind of like a spring, and that energy then can be used to bring the wings back up as they fly. So that's the furcula there. Now if we look at the wings, bring one wing up here. So here you can start to see the entirety of the wing, very long wings on these seabirds. And we'll start way out here. So these bones here are, I believe, the metacarpals. So that would be akin to kind of our wrist bones. And hand bones. And then these are actually the flanges out here, so kind of what would be akin to our finger bones. On this wing, you can just barely see it. So basically all of the digits are fused here. So this would be considered the first digit, and then there's a little tiny bone right here that's the second digit. And that second digit is actually what controls the alula. So when we looked at the wing morphology, we talked about the feathers they could bring up to increase or to change airflow at low speeds. That's that bone right there. So this is basically their hand. Or these are the fingers. This whole thing is their hand. Then we've got the radius and ulna, so this is akin to our forearm. So remember, the primary feathers are attached to these bones out here. The secondaries are attached to this long bone here. And I doubt you can see this in the screen, but I can actually feel the little bumps along the bone where the individual secondary feathers would attach. And then we have the humerus. This would be, analogous to our upper arm here, one big bone. And this is, again, where the major flight muscles attach. So a lot of musculature to this bone. This is, what is running to the plate here. So you can see these broad processes here at the edge of the bone for all that muscle to attach. They have a particular tendon called a strap that kind of wraps around and attaches here. That's for lifting the wing. And then the pectoralis comes up here and attaches directly here, and that's for the downstroke of the wing. So that's how they pull the wing up and down. So there we've got the wing of this bird. Now if I show you the other wing, here, hopefully you guys can see this okay. It's kind of hard to give you guys contrast here. You can actually see this is that second digit sticking out right there. Got his thumbs up there. It's not really the thumb, but it's the second finger. This is the bone that they use to control the alula that's sticking out on that one. Okay, then if we look at legs, and the tendons on this bird really tightened up, so the legs are kind of in a funky shape, but I'll do my best to show you. So again, bring this around. Here, this bone here is the femur. Okay, so that's the upper leg. This bone here is what we call the tibiotarsus, and this is basically what would be akin to our shin bone. Okay, then below the tibiotarsus we have the hypotarsus. So this is basically, you know, so this would be akin to our knee, this would be akin to our ankle. These are the fused foot bones, and then what we call the bird foot is, you know, here are the phalanges. These would actually be analogous to our finger bones. And on this particular bird, they have a pretty reduced hallux out. See the hallux on this foot? Oh, here, it's present on this foot. So this foot's really tightened here, but here is the, right here where my forceps are pointing, is the hallux, and then the 3 forward-pointing digits, right, the 3 forward-pointing phalanges. And so that forms the bird foot. So this is from, I'm pretty sure, a fulmar, so similar to the one we dissected. I have a few other bones from a couple other seabirds I picked up while I was on the beach. Just get his knee out of his rib cage and try to preserve that. I'll move that to the side. This, I'm pretty sure, is from a seagull. So again, this is the breastplate, and here you can see a really huge long keel. So in this case, gulls weigh a lot more. They need much bigger muscles to get into flight. So you can see very massive attachment point there. And then again, big furcula here. So you can see that furcula really clearly on this bird. This is that wishbone structure. This one, the rib cage is broken, but you can see the rib bones would be much larger. So this is a pretty big bird. Not sure, 100% sure what species this is from, but obviously different from this one, which had the much more short breastbone sternum. And then this, again, I don't know what this is from. Can't tell from the feet, but this is again kind of the spine. So this is kind of thoracic spine, lumbar spine, and then hip bone here. And again, this is just showing you, how much fusion there is in the hip bone. So, it's pretty much one solid plate. And again, with all the processes up here in the lumbar and thoracic spine, their back really isn't that flexible. Again, some flexibility in the tail, but most of their flexibility for looking around is up in their neck area. And again, now you can see the leg bones here. In this case, there's still some skin remaining here, so you can kind of see how the leg turns here into the feet. So again, just to orient you, this would basically be analogous to our upper leg and thigh. This would be analogous to our lower leg, kind of like our shin. So this is actually the bird's knee. This would be analogous to the ankle. Now in birds, though, this is the major joint that you see, when they're walking. In most birds, this joint is actually covered by the feathers, so you don't actually see the bird knee. So the backward bend that you see in birds when they're walking would be analogous to our ankle, with the foot and phalanges down here forming the lower part of the leg and foot on a bird. If you guys are meat eaters, right? If you eat drumsticks, that's up here. That's where all the musculature is. Everything down here is controlled by tendons that attach to the muscles up here. And that's, again, important for birds because that helps them maintain their center of gravity closer to their body, right? They don't want these big heavy legs hanging out. So this is kind of where the muscle is, the meat. And then out here, this is all controlled through tendons that attach to muscles up here. And that's similar to the arrangement in their wings. So kind of showing you this wing again, right? If you eat chicken wings or whatever, this is where you're getting the meat. You get a little bit off here, but this is mostly just skin, and there's nothing but tendon extending beyond that. So some smaller muscles here, some bigger muscles here, and then the breast muscles are mostly what powers flight, with movements out here controlled by the smaller muscles along these bones, with long tendons that run out to the outer digits. So that's the bird skeleton. So finally, let's take a look at the structure of the bone itself. So here I have a femur from bird, so this is the upper leg bone, and I basically cut it longitudinally so that we can look at the internal structure. And bird bones are famously hollow. This makes them much lighter, but they have a lot of unique structures to make sure that they're still strong structures for the birds. So let's zoom in a little bit. And we'll start by looking here towards the end of the bone. You guys can see kind of within the bone it's hollow, but it has all of these struts. And the struts in there really give the bone a lot more rigidity. So they prevent the bone from flexing despite it being hollow, and makes the bones provide a lot of strength and support. As we move down the bone, you can see that it's hollow throughout. And while that hollowness is primarily there for weight savings, it does mean that there's some space in here for other functions as well. This is a leg bone, so there probably isn't much in here, but certainly in some of the larger bones at the base of the wing, there's actually some of the air sacs will actually go into the hollow bone structure themselves. Now, as we get to the other end here, you do see there's a little bit of dry tissue in here, right in kind of where the joint is. In mammal bones, we know that our bones are filled with bone marrow, and this is where we have a lot of our blood production. Birds do have bone marrow, but obviously it would kind of defeat the purpose of having hollow bones if you filled it with bone marrow. But that tissue you see in there is the bone marrow. So the bone marrow in birds tends to be located near the joints of larger bones like this femur. All right, we'll zoom in just a little more here, look at kind of the fine tail structure here. And one of the kind of unique aspects of avian bone is that the bone material itself is actually denser than similar mammalian bone. So if you kind of look at the walls of the bone here, you can see it's very dense and smooth. If you look at just the bone material itself, the material is denser, so it's heavier than mammalian bone, and again, that adds strength, but now you have this kind of overall hollow bone with struts, meaning that the overall bone isn't any heavier than mammalian bone. A lot of people think that the bones themselves are lighter. Size for size, the bird bones aren't really much lighter than mammalian bone, but they are stronger for a given weight. So that means you can end up with kind of smaller bones serving to support greater weight bearing or strength bearing. So pound for pound, you get more out of bird bone in terms of strength than you would out of mammalian bone for similarly sized mammals.